And I welcome everyone to Press TV's News Review program, where we get in-depth in one of the day's top stories. Now, 90 years ago, the University of Chicago in the U.S. borrowed tens of thousands of archaeological fragments discovered in Iran's ancient city of Persepolis for research. However, after nearly a century, and despite many official requests and a court ruling, Washington is still refusing to return them using a variety of pretexts. But Tehran is now resolved to get back what is its rightful possessions.
These artifacts are just a few amongst the thousands of clay tablets discovered in an excavation in Iran's old city of Persepolis more than 9 decades ago. Back then, American archaeologists borrowed the Persepolis collection for a period of 3 years for translation, research, and cataloging. Flash forward 90 years, and many of these ancient fragments are still at the Oriental Institute in the University of Chicago. At some points over the past decades, Washington even attempted to seize this collection of antiquities using its anti-Iran allegations. But in 2018, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of Iran's ownership of these assets. Susan Charaghchi, a legal expert with Iran's Ministry of Cultural Heritage, says it is time for these artifacts to return home.
This is the year 2022. 4 years have passed since the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in favor of lifting the ban on these tablets. But the Persepolis tablets, the borrowed properties of the Iranian government and nation, have not returned home, except for a few of them. Still, the majority of these valuable artifacts are in the possession of the Oriental Institute, and logically, after 9 decades, they need to be sent back to Iran.
She has even disclosed some parts of the correspondence taking place between Iranian and American officials in 1934, based on which the American side agrees to return the inscribed tablets at its own expense. Another article requires the Chicago University's Oriental Institute to send copies of the works, reviews, and collections to Iran's then Ministry of Instruction. Promises never fulfilled. American experts themselves stress the significance of these antiquities for studying ancient Persian history.
These tablets are one of the most important sources for us about the Achaemenid dynasty at their peak.
Majid Takht-Ravanchi, a distinguished Iranian expert of ancient languages, says these tablets reveal some remarkable information about the ruling period of Darius the Great.
One of the clay tablets reveal an order by Darius the Great to an assistant to give 100 of Darius's own sheep to a woman. Decoding this tablet reveals that all of the clay manuscripts belong to the era of Darius.
Iran's ambassador to the United Nations, Majid Takht-Ravanchi, says Americans are using different excuses to postpone the return of what is part of Iran's culture and history. But Iran's request is clear, that what has been loaned must return completely, orderly, and safely. At the end of the day, these antiquities are nothing but the belongings of the Iranian nation and representatives of their long history.
And now joining us for the program is Mr. Edward Corrigan, international human rights lawyer from London, Ontario, and Mr. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, joining us from Bristol. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program. Mr. Edward Corrigan, I guess we'll start with you. Your initial thoughts on why Iran can't get these artifacts back?
Well, there's no legal basis for the American government to hold them. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled in Iran's favor, and it's, there's no higher court in the United States that could rule on this matter. And it's just, I think, arrogance and indifference and sort of a colonial attitude that somehow these, items which have basically been stolen from Iran, even though they're promised only to be loaned for 3 years, that they don't have to return it. And this is, 90 years. This is, going back to the 1930s, and it clearly is a priceless artifact from Persia's history, and one of the most interesting leaders of the Iranian or Persian Empire. And it's just a form of arrogance and indifference. They don't think they're bound by the law, and this is predates the Shah. This is it really boggles the mind. But there are other examples of European powers, looting and taking, artifacts from various countries. I joke sometimes that the British Museum in London, England's got more mummies than Egypt does. They've got a huge mummy collection. There was a great controversy for years over what's called the Elgin marbles, which were taken by the British from Greece, many years ago. I think now they've been returned. But this is something that's, there's no rational, legal, or moral basis for holding on to this, except it's outright theft, and it's an irritant, that the United States can sort of, stick into Iran. It makes no sense. I suppose the next step is, there's perhaps maybe suing the Chicago Oriental Institute directly and maybe trying to seize some of their assets or something, or putting a judgment against them. But, this is just simply, it's very petty and unreasonable. The United States simply should return the property to Iran because, as the Supreme Court of the United States says, it belongs to, to the Iranian nation and the Iranian people. And there's no legal or moral or political justification for retaining these. And it's, I guess, if I was the United States, I'd be very embarrassed that they're in this sort of discussion. But this is unfortunately a problem that has existed in other cases where the European powers and the Americans have taken, artifacts from other countries. And, it's really a form of cultural theft and theft of history. So it's very unfortunate. There's no higher basis than the U.S. Supreme Court in the United States, and they've ruled in Iran's favor.
Yes.
So it's time for the American government to get its act together and return the property to Iran.
Thank you, Edward. And Tony, welcome to the program. It's funny that Tony out of Bristol, Persepolis was also not just the University of Chicago, but there's also a ton of stuff in British museums that were taken from Persepolis. Tony, let me read this article, Tony, before you start really quick. That I was actually on shift a couple of years ago in 2019 when 1,700 pieces from this very museum, or from this the university archive, were returned to the Iranian government. The Iranian government said back in October 1st of 2019, this is according to the Chicago Tribune, the Iranian government says nearly 1,800 ancient artifacts have arrived in Iran as part of the return of thousands of antiquities loaned decades ago to the University of Chicago. The government's website says artifacts arrived in Tehran on Monday, accompanied by 2 academics from the university. This is the 4th consignment of artifacts that have been returned since 2004. Other shipments were also made in 1948 and in 1950. Another 17,000 artifacts from the initial loan remain in the U.S. Tell us what's going on from your perspective, Tony.
Well, look, I wonder what's in the, written on the artifacts on these little clay tablets that have been retained, because they are likely to send back to Iran the stuff which is of less interest and historical relevance. But, this is a lesson here for those writing contracts. If you're going to demand something is returned after it's borrowed, you've got to put a date. It's a bit like taking out a library book, make sure you bring it back by a certain date. And it looks like that was missing from the loan agreement to the Americans. But look, it was mostly the American teams that dug this, were doing these digs back in around, the 1930s. So they were saying, well, look, we found it, we need to take it back and analyze it. Another very important thing to say about this is it doesn't make any sense to have a partial collection of these ancient artifacts. The only way you can really make sense of what was going on back in the time of Darius the Great is by having everything. So you're able to put all together all the different aspects. These tablets apparently had a lot of information about what was going in and out of the big palaces. So it was basically administrative. So absolutely brilliant and fascinating when it comes to putting together the way these ancient civilizations worked and operated. But this is almost like all of the big powers were over in the Middle East, weren't they? In fact, in other parts of Asia too. In the first half of, or the first few decades of the 20th century, digging around. we had all sorts of excavations, around the time of the First World War and up to the Second World War, as the big powers tried to get hold of these very important historical artifacts. And for example, it was the Dead Sea Scrolls that were revealed just a decade or so after these digs that we're talking about here in Persia, in Iran. So this, I think, is indicative of an attempt to really control what is discovered from the past. And in fact, a lot of people will say, well, they only show us now what they want to show us. This was a very, very important part of history. Actually, we British boast about having the first human rights law, the Magna Carta. Oh, no, I'm afraid that's not true. Cyrus the Great, 1,500, or nearly 2,000 years, in fact, before the British, he instituted something which was the first Charter of Human Rights in the world. So it's a very important area of history and a very important historical area. The United States, by the way, is saying that the tablets they've got came from between 1933 and 1938. So it was a bit of a scrabble before the outbreak of the Second World War, and we're talking about something like 1,800 small tablets. So, I mean, this is a terrible thing for the Americans to not return this piece of history. And I'll just sort of finish by saying, well, we have in Britain, of course, everyone knows George Orwell. What he said was, he controls the past, controls the future, and he who controls the present controls the past. And so I think there is an element of this which is an attempt to control the historical narrative and perhaps to blacken the name of the Persian Empire in Iran, because as anyone that looks into history will know, that the captive Jews in Babylon were liberated, by these people, by this empire, by this Persian Empire, and returned to Jerusalem. And I think it would be nice if the Israelis would acknowledge that.
Gentlemen, always a pleasure to check in with both of you. Stay safe, and thank you both for joining us on the program. Mr. Edward Corrigan from London, Ontario, and Tony Gosling there joining us out of Bristol. And viewers, that's it for your Press TV News Review program. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye for now.